Welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. We're committed to bringing you thought leaders in the field to discuss what's new and noteworthy in the healthcare sector. Now your host, Rick Giannato.
There's a tendency to think about healthcare policy and healthcare markets as two different conversations. Washington debates Medicare, Medicaid, drug pricing, reimbursement, and regulation. Wall Street looks at earnings, margins, valuations, and where capital is going next. But I think that distinction is becoming increasingly artificial because in healthcare, policy is becoming a leading market indicator. Think about what happens when Washington changes a reimbursement formula. It doesn't remain a policy decision for very long. It moves through health plans, hospitals, physician practices, pharmaceutical companies, investors, and eventually patients. Change Medicaid eligibility requirements, and you're potentially changing hospital payer mix and uncompensated care. Redesign Medicare Part D, and you're reallocating economic risk among manufacturers, plans, PBMs, pharmacies, and ultimately beneficiaries. Change Medicare Advantage reimbursement or regulation, and you're affecting the economics of some of the largest healthcare companies in the country. And now add AI, where healthcare organizations are making significant capital decisions while the regulatory, governance, and even liability frameworks are still developing. So increasingly, understanding healthcare markets requires understanding Washington, and understanding healthcare policy requires understanding what happens when that policy collides with operational and economic reality. That's the intersection I want to explore today. Because policy can create an opportunity on paper, capital can recognize that opportunity, but ultimately somebody has to execute it. My guest today is a regular here on the podcast, Emily Evans of Hedgeye. She spends her time thinking about these issues from healthcare and the perspective of markets, policies, companies, and of course, investors. We're going to talk about Medicaid and what work requirements could actually mean economically. We're going to look at Medicare Part D and the redistribution of risk occurring across the pharmaceutical ecosystem. We'll talk about managed care, Medicare Advantage, AI, and where institutional capital may be moving next. But underneath all of those subjects is a larger question. What is the healthcare market getting wrong because it's underestimating policy? I'm Rick Giannato, and welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. Let's get into it. Emily, so great to see you. Have you back on the show as our resident expert on all things with the markets, policy, hedge funds, all that. It is great to see you, and welcome back to the Healthcare Nation.
Well, thanks, Rick. It's great to be here. Always fun to catch up with you.
Listen, I've got so much to cover today. I really wanted to go over Washington, Wall Street, and maybe, and I know this is right in your wheelhouse, how policy is playing and influencing and perhaps even reshaping a lot of what's happening in the healthcare capital markets, if I can characterize it that way. I think, look, and I hope you'd agree, healthcare has always been shaped by innovation, but now there's so many changes out of DC at the state level with policy. But I think it's bending the curve on that. So let me just jump in with my first question. With that said, what is healthcare, in the healthcare market mispricing today because investors are underestimating the impact of policy?
Nearly everything. You probably want
That's
a more
broad
specific
answer.
You want a more specific answer. The market so far, I think, and this isn't really their job, but right now, but their markets so far are underappreciating a number of the seismic differences or changes that are going on. And a lot of that stems from, it's all got to boil down to a EBITDA or EPS number, right? And the Wall Street will regard, for example, the decline in enrollment in Medicare Advantage and in commercial and in Affordable Care Act plans as a good thing as premiums rise. So you get more revenue per person because premiums have gone up, but you have less people. And the term that we use is, margin over members. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good for a Wall Streeter, but if you're a policymaker, you don't like that, right? You don't want to see less people insured. You don't want to see people falling out of the Medicare Advantage plan or the ACA plan, which is filled with fraud. been able to replicate a lot of the studies on that. But they don't appreciate that what's shaping up here is some pretty big policy problems with unknown consequences. I think the other thing that Wall Street is failing to do is to appreciate the direct to consumer channel in drugs and how that is reshaping how people think about what drugs they take. And I think that's a pretty seismic event. And I think that they are also underestimating the implications for the MAHA movement, which is tailor-made to get people to demand less healthcare, right? Because they're healthier. and God forbid we should want that. So those are three areas.
Yeah, let me ask you, when the folks that you're interacting with in your day-to-day encounter professionally with what you're doing, obviously at Hedgeye and dealing with the markets, are folks recognizing that the policy issues, that's really a policy sensitive component with respect to healthcare and the health sector? I mean, are you factoring that in? And if so, is that new? Is it being dialed up?
You know, it's funny. Wall Street's always been pretty good at trying to assess the negatives when it comes to healthcare policy. And I'm thinking specifically of payment policies. You know, the payments to physicians or hospitals or whatever. They've always been pretty good at sussing that out and being very attentive to it. I think their challenge right now is they're not really able to see or understand and appreciate the kind of the demographic shifts, the shift in attitude, you know, which are not really measurable yet. It's hard to really know how some of this stuff is going to go. But I mean, they generally are good at sniffing out the downside, but not necessarily the upside. That's been my observation over the years. But in the time I've been doing this, last 25 years, I have noticed that increasingly Wall Street is less interested in policy to their peril. But because for a long time, they were super interested in, these Medicare payment policies, and they get very interested in what the FDA does, but they haven't really, I think, clued in on the larger trends that we're seeing and that you and I've talked about, offline.
Yeah, and I would think, and I don't want to jump to conclusions, that recognition, that sensitivity, and you mentioned the MAHA movement earlier, that it's probably been dialed up a lot because of that, whereas maybe historically there's been more healthcare policy stability from administration to administration.
Correct. And I think that's where the peril lies, really, is thinking that it's going to be done the way it's always been done, and you can expect certain things. And like a great operating assumption, if you will, of Wall Street is that, the big insurance companies are too powerful and they give too much money to health insurers and so forth. And so nothing will really change. And that could be right. But I don't know. And people start getting tossed off your rolls because they're too sick, which is what you have to do if you're emphasizing margin over members, right? You have to shed the people, however you do it, that are expensive. That's what you have to do. And that's not a great place to find yourself in with policymakers. So the assumption, okay, they've got a lot of lobbying dollars, they've got a lot of people on the Hill, all still true, but is their case for policymakers still as strong as it was 15 years ago? And I don't think that's the case at all. I think the hospitals are under assault here for being highly concentrated, for charging too much money, and they're a little bit on their back foot, which has not been the case historically. So we have I think a not quite good understanding on Wall Street of how the dynamic has changed.
Let me drill down into an area where I think obviously it has huge impact. And whether you call it operational policy or a capital market event, I think when you look at Medicaid work requirements, probably much more than social policy, it's a fundamental shift in healthcare economics. I want to drill down when you think about the Medicaid work requirements, what that's going to, or how that will impact and how it's going to impact the state level and have that ripple effect across the board. In general terms, Emily, what are your thoughts on that as we move forward?
Historically, Medicaid work requirements have not really had an impact on enrollment historically. However, as the program has been a target for a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse, one of the effects of work requirements is it connects an individual to a job, and that job has to be documented. When you go to work for, you remember you always have to have your passport or your social security card or whatever. That connection is having the effect of sussing out fraud in the system. So that's a different dynamic than we've had historically with work requirements, and that will have the effect of sending some people off the rolls, kind of into underground healthcare, to the extent that they actually exist. There's a lot of phantom people, enrolling in healthcare programs because it's not hard to do. So it has a different effect now. But one of the things that I think is important to point out here is if you look at the history of health policy, really up until the expansion of the Medicaid program, and even then, the expansion was capped right at 135% of the federal poverty level. We had this philosophy, if you will, in policy that we should direct Medicaid dollars we should direct these federal programs to the needy. The deserving poor was the term when we were younger, for example. And what the Medicaid expansion did is kind of crack that a little bit. Instead of saying we're not going to send Medicaid dollars to pregnant women, disabled, blind, dual eligible, et cetera, we're going to send Medicaid dollars to people who are under 135% of the federal poverty level, which has the effect of, one, getting people to lie about their income, right? Get health care if you're under 135% of income. But also it says that deserving poor thing, if you will, I don't like that phrase, but that isn't part of our thinking or our philosophy when it comes to the Medicaid program. You're seeing the same thing go on in the SNAP benefit as well, where
that's such a departure, isn't it, from the initial policy mission in pulling together the initiative, right? I mean, when you think of it, pegging it to the number, and I get it for the poverty level, but excluding that groups, or at least not having that be the test for eligibility exclusively.
If you go back and you think about the whole debate over Medicaid in the 60s when it was implemented, the reason it was implemented for the very poor, dual eligible and elderly, blind, disabled, et cetera, is because people were, policymakers were like, well, you should work, go to work if you don't have these conditions, if you're not in that. And that was the departure with the Affordable Care Act, was to no longer say, well, go to work if you need health benefits. Okay. A blind individual and dual eligible individual, you can't say that to them, right? You can't say, okay, well, just go to work. And so that was a departure in the way we had thought about Medicaid from the early 20th century up until the Affordable Care Act. The work requirements try and bring that back. Now, it has this fraud, waste, and abuse benefit, but it's really trying to get the policy to move back towards, hey, if you can get up, get out, get a job, you don't, you shouldn't need Medicaid, and not everybody is comfortable with that, but that's definitely the policy shift. We'll see what kind of an impact it has on enrollment. I think the biggest impact is going to be on the fraud, waste, and abuse front.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the investment for the necessary platform infrastructure that's going to be required at the state level is going to be significant in terms of eligibility criteria and looking at the population that would be, potentially enrolled, eligible, et cetera. And with that said, I mean, if you are not effective in entering the system one way or the other, it could artificially leave some folks out.
Oh, yeah.
Who are deserving, as well as, getting into the fraud side.
Right. Yeah. That's always been a problem. Now, since 2014, when the Medicaid expansion was implemented, and if you recall, during that period, while states were getting adjusted, there was a halt on redeterminations. And that went on for, I guess, 18 months to 2 years. And we had another halt on redeterminations during the public health emergency 2020 to 2023. And during the first halt on redeterminations, most states, not all, but most states really ramped their eligibility mechanisms so that they're like these automated systems, like, Rick applies for Medicaid and it goes out and it looks for your W-2, and or tax return. It can, those are the kinds of things that we can do now that we couldn't do 20 years ago. So it is easier, but yes, people get caught, being ineligible when they are. I think most states do a pretty good job of making sure they accommodate those individuals. Assuming those individuals, want to accommodate, and that is not easy. And I mean, if they end up in the hospital, if they end up in that situation, there are all these mechanisms at the bedside that can say, okay, are you eligible? And you can enroll under a lot of state programs that way. So I am less worried and concerned about that. And from a policy perspective, I think the biggest change is, all right, we're taking a different philosophy towards this program than we have, since 2010. I think that's a bigger force shaping the program.
Yeah, and with respect to like signing folks up who are eligible, I remember in New York we had a huge initiative across all the 11 hospitals for health and hospitals to enroll folks as they came through the ED who did not have it, and that was very, very effective. And I could see that type of mechanism, being expanded, maybe leveraging IT. But one final question on just when we think about Medicaid work requirements, if you think about the health sector kind of writ large and financial risks, who is most exposed, if you thought about it, in terms of this, this move and the emphasis?
Yeah, specifically in the Medicaid program, there was a huge push into it by the big managed care organizations. And I think they're at greater risk. So that's Centene, Molina, UnitedHealth Group, Elevance, and then there's a bunch of Blues plans, of course.
So all the managed Medicaid kind of providers,
because they get paid on a per person basis. So less persons, less payment. And what they've been doing is going to their states and getting, rate adjustments. That I've noticed that has been a mixed bag. Centene reported, okay, we got some rate adjustments, but UnitedHealth Group did not, Elevance did not. So there's, it depends on, who they are and how that is going, but they're the most at risk because the retrospective enrollment or that bedside enrollment is still available in a lot of states. I think the providers are less affected. I do think they face a ton of risk with changes in supplemental payments and state-directed payments and those kinds of changes coming over the next couple of years that they're going to need to adapt to. I mean, the bottom line is there's less money flowing from the federal treasury to healthcare than there was 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah. Let me switch to an area that I know you have deep expertise in, and that's the pharmaceutical side of things. And if I think about, I don't want to say the largest pharmaceutical capital reallocation in years, but just thinking about Part D and what's happening right now, I wanted to get your thoughts on, what's the state of the program, IRA implementations, pharmacoeconomics, PBMs, premium dynamics. What's happening?
Let's talk about first the premium subsidy program that the Biden administration put in place in 2023, right? Let's talk about that. So what happened? What happened was Congress redesigned the Part D benefit, and it reduced dramatically the government's reinsurance program for that Part D benefit. In other words, they stopped being the backstop for 80% of the cost. Okay,
they redesigned the incentives, right? Basically,
they redesigned the incentives. So the incentives went from let's push as much of this benefit cost onto the federal government as possible, as fast as possible, which of course means higher prices, right? Because you want those list prices to keep going up. To let's not do that. Let's keep the costs down as much as we can, which is a huge change. And what did it do? It started driving up, or it threatened to drive up, Part D premiums. The Part D premium, the standalone Part D premium, not paired with a Medicare Part C, Medicare Advantage, but is hugely popular. It's like most people over 65 have the Part D benefit. And, you're heading into an election year, and this hugely popular program is looking at, 30, 40% increases in premiums. And so what does the Biden administration do? It comes up with a risk corridor / subsidization program to keep those premium increases off of the playing field. The Trump administration just said we're not doing that anymore, and so premiums in Part D are going to rise. This is going to create a really interesting dynamic because Medicare Advantage plans are not super popular with providers outside of the urban areas because they don't get paid, for their services. But those people like the Part D program. So you have people who need the drug benefit being pushed into the Medicare Advantage Part D and C program at the same time that rural and community providers are like, we can't make any money. We can't survive if we've got to take Humana's plan. And so you've got this tension in that system that we've never had before. And I think that's going to be really, really tricky to navigate.
Are they? So Emily, now are they, if I can put it this way, are the markets now repricing the Part D piece because of this?
The insurance markets are, but not necessarily at Wall Street. I think we'll wait to see what the enrollment does as a result of this. My people and the dynamic could play out the same way it's in the insurance market, which is if you aren't taking any expensive drugs, you aren't you'll drop the Part D benefit and you'll just go Medicare Part A and B fee for service. If you are taking very expensive drugs, you're going to want to stay in that program, which means what? You're going to have ratepayers who need the service and not enough of the ratepayers who don't, which is when insurance markets tend to break.
Yeah. Who absorbs economic risk in that entire calculus?
In that entire calculus, the Part D beneficiary who drops the program because they don't like the premiums and they don't take a lot of meds, they absorb the risk, obviously, to developing a condition that would require them to take those medications. The insurance company
going uncovered, right? I mean, that's basically it for the drug side.
Yeah, that we're seeing that in the regular market. So, why shouldn't we see it here, right? The other economic risk is going to be borne by the Part D plans, who will have a adverse selection problem with the Part D beneficiaries, where they end up with a bunch of people who need high-priced drugs. That's why they're in the program, and not enough people who need a statin every 90 days.
Yeah. And I don't want to draw an analogy, but it almost seems like the ACA subsidy and then the Part D subsidy, both being, they were open-ended in the Biden administration without an end point, perhaps thinking there would be a continued Democrat in the White House. But then both, the clock ran out with respect to the Trump administration. Is that fair to say?
I think, and you kind of just pulling on that thread a bit more. The drug channel, the ever increasing prices of drugs have subsidized the system. And I mean the whole system. And with that, as those prices come under pressure because of the subsidization going away, that is going to have impact all over the system. And you're starting to see some of that. So you've got a really interesting dynamic here. But yeah, the music stopped in January of 2025, and there's no real plan for it to start. A friend of mine was at the HFMA conference a couple months ago, and Casey Mulligan from Health and Human Services essentially said in so many words, the money spigot's being turned off. Make your plans. Get prepared for more efficient management, better understanding of your customers, whatever you think is necessary. But he was very clear about that.
Yeah. Interesting. I think it's so many different areas we're seeing that, and the expectation that leverage technology to get you there too.
That's absolutely the case. And I think, to the credit of the administration, is that they are going a long way to say, hey, how do we make this easier for you? And we're definitely seeing that in drug approvals. I mean, AI is not going to cure cancer, and I don't know why these venture capitalists keep saying that. What AI is going to do is create the tools for the people who are going to evaluate, treat, and cure disease. That's what's happening. That's what's going to happen, and that's which is a great thing. I think kind of related to that with technology is that Epic Systems, which is the big EHR, which is in 70% of American hospitals, right? It's some serious concentrated risk, but nobody knows that because it's a private company. And
it sounds like regulatory capture to me.
It was the most egregious regulatory capture on the history of the planet. But it nonetheless, what they're pushing towards at the Office of the National Coordinator is a system that is more friendly to innovation in electronic health records, which is definitely new.
Yeah. Let me stay on the AI theme and just think about the next capital cycle. So if we thought, maybe it's moving from innovation to more of a enterprise infrastructure. And I've always said the big opportunity, at least initially, is low-hanging fruit, whether it's pre-authorization or just the velocity of care with respect to paperwork, that entire area. And, if you thought about that with respect to, investment risk and what is strategic versus experimental, is there some coalescing now around, where, like you mentioned, a lot of investment in the next big cancer drug or that kind of thing. Are we seeing a little bit more refinement now as things evolve, or is it still all over the place with respect to that kind of investment?
Yeah, I think that healthcare, to its credit, has been mostly thoughtful and careful about the use of AI. Um, in the certainly in the clinical setting or in the discovery setting, where I would say, the rubber meets the road, right? Um, are we using AI, in a way to drive up costs in some ways? Yeah, the insurance companies put together their AI machines to deny billing, and now the hospitals have put together their AI to figure out what the machine will let them bill, and so these two, battle of the machines is underway. But I think that's going to be resolved, right? At some point, there will be stasis. There will be an impasse, and so outside of that, I think everybody's been pretty thoughtful about how can this help things? How can this make work more productive? How can it make it better, more accurate? I think those are the kinds of things that are happening. And honestly, just because of HIPAA and other privacy rules, a lot of it is happening inside the four walls of a hospital. It's not really floating out there in some big commercial project quite yet. So I think we're going to see some things show up here in the next few years as those things get commercialized, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and that might mean more efficiency and utility within the four walls of the hospital, but not being able to scale and really leverage it across, geographies and across populations. That seems to me to be the big opportunity then.
Yeah.
Because also a lot of the hospitals, if they're within their silo, this single channel, there's so many limitations with respect to what they can or can't do. And if I dare say it, what they can even afford to deploy. A rural hospital may have a very different, capital tolerance versus a big academic or a multi-system.
Yeah. And different attitudes, a rural hospital may see the need for more efficient, operations, whereas an academic medical center, that's anathema, efficient operations. So,
Right.
so that's so you've got those kind of tensions. Something to watch, I think, is what kind of papers get published coming out of work. ICU admissions and ICU turns, for example. I know there's a lot of cool AI work going on at some hospitals there. It'll be really interesting to see. All right, how did that improve patient care? And I haven't seen anything published yet on it, but that's something I think to watch for here, just to see how it's progressing.
Yeah, I think that with getting back to the utility piece, something like sepsis detection, early sepsis, or even citing, if you wanted to think, gosh, I've got X number of patients in my ED, who's critical, who's urgent, who's emergent, where should I put them in a tight capacity kind of situation, probably has great application.
I think so too. And I think there's, I always think of it this way. If you think of the best doctor you've ever met, right? Just outstanding, surgeon or physician. You think of that guy or gal, and that person is really great because they practiced a long time. They were well trained. They're very smart. They're sincere. They're dedicated. All those features of a human being, right? What I think we want to think about AI is how do you get more of those people, or how do you get them earlier, rather than how do we get a robot to take care of grandma? I think that's a silly aim. The right aim is how do you get, that surgeon up to speed in 4 years, what took 8, or 6 years, what took 8. I think that's really the critical question that hospital administrators and policymakers should really be making, not how do you cure cancer? We love to boil the ocean in healthcare.
And it also, when you think about the workforce shortage coming up with physicians, certain specialties, obviously, and the nursing world, I think anytime you can free up the time when they're, at the keyboard versus at the bedside, has a clear impact with respect to clinical outcomes, being able to really assess a patient, but also their quality of life, and even from a, economic perspective in terms of FTEs.
Yeah, Epic had their big national users group meeting this week, and it sounds like they've got no interest in anybody getting away from the keyboard. They had like this boatload of products, and I'm just thinking about the doctors I know, right? You just want to practice medicine. They don't want to build the data layer for Epic.
And maybe in conflict with their business model, right? Could be. Emily, let me go into a lightning round if I can, as we kind of close up the show. I want to just think about where's institutional capital moving. Just think about the sector across the board. I hate to be binary, but we can put it down to bullish or bearish. Let's start with hospitals. What do you think?
Bearish. Yeah. Headwinds from payment policies, headwinds from public policy that's kind of like, you guys are kind of expensive. Why don't you get your house in order and then come talk to us? And demographics. The last of the big cohorts for the post-war generation turns 65 next year. So the demographics that have been the demographics that made American healthcare are now fading.
Yeah. What happens to rural hospitals in that equation?
I'm going to answer. I'm going to know more next week. I'm going to the Torch conference down in Austin, but I think that there's actually a tailwind for rural hospitals, not just because they're getting $50 billion out of the Rural Health Transformation Program, but also because the American economic policy right now is to bring a lot of the manufacturing home, and manufacturing does not cite itself in New York City. It's in, you could see all the announcements for pharmaceuticals builds in Western North Carolina, for example, and in Texas and so forth. So there is probably a rural revival. And the question is, can they accommodate the needs of people? When you have an economic development officer coming to town looking to site a big project, they ask two questions. What are the schools like, and what's the healthcare like? And it remains to be seen how well the rural health community can adapt. That I don't for a minute doubt their sincerity and their interest in doing that. But that's an open question.
And the $50 billion definitely gave a little lift to that. Probably.
It helps.
Yeah. Let me go on the bullish bearish. How about Medicare Advantage?
I am very negative on Medicare Advantage. The demographics, your year over year.
Only 50% are enrolled, right? Of Medicare.
Only 50%, but the other 50% live in places like Uvalde, Texas. Right. and Medicare Advantage basically says to these hospitals, well, we're not going to pay you. And the hospitals accept it begrudgingly because they have EMTALA concerns. But it's penetrating the rural markets, especially if those Part D premiums, are driving up the overall premium. That's going to be tough. We'll have to see. So I'm pretty bearish on Medicare Advantage.
How about pharma manufacturers? And let me do a subset in that, GLPs. So
GLPs are turning into, I think, a seismic shift in America. Kind of like, well, the whole, body positive thing that we went through, a few years ago. And I think the GLP-1s are important for, really communicating, hey, being overweight is not good for your health. That's just the way it is. And you should, and here we're making it better for you, or easier for you to do that. I think the most important thing GLP-1 drugs are doing, though, is going direct to the consumer and cutting out PBMs and wholesalers. And, let's just have Lilly sell their product.
And it was fast too, right? That conversion was pretty darn fast.
Well, I mean, weight loss, come on. It's like selling the fountain of youth. It definitely was fast, but you can tack on a lot of things to that. Will there be direct consumer for infusion drugs? No, I don't think so. But think of all the drugs that you can purchase direct to consumer, and you should purchase direct to consumer. And suddenly that whole channel looks really, really different. So I'm very bullish on the big biopharma companies, because I think they've got a lot of upside.
One piece on the GLPs, do you think it'll be as ubiquitous as statins?
Yeah, I think it will be. Yeah. But it'll probably have a shorter lifespan. There's a point at which you don't want to keep losing weight, right? And you slow that down. So we've got a little run here where the adoption curve is pretty strong, and then it should level out as people get happier with their weight and what they're eating, which is not really true with statins. They kind of stick with you for a while.
Yeah. How about the biotech side of the health sector?
I'm kind of bearish on biotech for this reason. But the biotech industry, like venture broadly, owes a lot of its existence to very cheap money. And that very cheap money can go off and look at really crazy ideas. The trial record for American biotech companies is not great. It maybe that improves with AI tools that are developing, but now you can, develop an AI tool and start a biotech company with very little overhead, very little footprint. And that means that there'll be more of you, which means that when biopharma comes knocking for the next M&A deal, they got a lot to choose from. And that, I think, is pretty negative for the industry.
Here's a biggie, only because I see this all the time. What about longevity?
Longevity. I'm kind of a mixed. My analysis of that is pretty mixed. Some of this peptide stuff, I'm like not very sure. Is that really something the government wants to endorse? The data is not really, of course, I mean, part of the problem is the government never let it through the door, right, to get the data gathered. So we don't know. But some of it, we'll see. I think the biggest effect is really the MAHA movement. Be healthy, exercise, sunshine, eat whole foods. I mean, these are things, our mothers taught us, right? Years ago. That probably has a bigger impact on longevity than and who wants to live to be 110 anyway? I mean, everybody I've ever seen at 110, I'm like, well, no thanks.
Right. Yeah. It's like the old car, right? It's, I'm with you on that.
Yeah. Before you take it in for rehab.
Right. So, Emily, let me bring it home with this one last question. If you think about, I don't know, I guess what should every C-suite exec in the sector, really across the board, and their board be thinking about with respect to, and I want to go back to policy, where we're at politically, are there any policy events that might have the greatest impact or potential to influence the markets over 12 months that group needs to think about?
I think I'm going to give you a top line first. And I'm going to tell you that if you're running a hospital in particular, you're running any healthcare organization, but if you're running a hospital, you really need to get your business man on. You've got to start thinking about a hospital as an operation with a very strong social good component. Okay. You cannot, if you think that you're going to survive by going to Washington with your hand out and saying, hey, we need more money for dish, or we need more this, that, I don't think that's going to work. I think that the public is generally tired of how expensive this stuff has gotten. Hospitals in particular are being demonized in a very slick, opposition campaign that's running, and it's working. And it comes from years of just having no idea what your cost controls are, and B, setting your revenue line to be, a decent margin above your cost controls. Guess what? That doesn't work out here in the real world, and it's not going to work, going forward. So that's sort of my top line thing. But I would say that the single biggest policy change that is flying under the radar is the price transparency. You knew I was going to mention it. Price transparency. The Patients Deserve Price Tags Act has cleared Senate help. It looks like it's tracking for passage before midterms, as an attaboy for Senator Bill Cassidy, who's leaving. And what that would do is extend price transparency to hospitals' biggest threat, and that's ambulatory surgery centers, and also labs and imaging. And that's when you have a real market there. You actually have consumers who are price sensitive, and people who are willing to put a price tag on stuff. And that has significant implications for how the sector is going to operate going forward. And if you don't understand that, you should probably find another CEO.
I almost think that it impacts two things. One is at the individual, the citizen level, they'll be infuriated with respect to the variability in price across the board. And that will drive one set of actions, behaviors, maybe played out in the voting booth. The other side is on the capital side. The free market will say, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to get in there and compete with respect to what we have. Maybe the caveat being there's got to be a quality component dialed into it as well.
Yeah, I think that's the missing piece in the price transparency is the quality component, and what we have is not good. Doctors are super sensitive about talking trash about the guy down the street or the girl down the street. So it's a difficult area that it has to be kind of handled by a independent entity. But it's a very important one. There's the fact of the matter is some doctors are really good at certain things, not at other things, and those other things other doctors are good at, and weed through it, kind of thing. But I think that's a big missing piece, and it will evolve. I think. And one of the, I was talking to a surgeon yesterday, and we were talking about here, one of the big brands in Nashville, it's got a great brand, but it doesn't have, a great cardiology department. The great cardiology department is not at the brand. They're down the road, and nobody knows that because they go to the brand. So that's going to turn people who run hospitals into people who think about quality, price, cost, patient experience, the food, the housekeeping, all those things.
As it should be.
Emily,
as usual, it's great having you on. Great to see you. I love your insights. I know our audience does as well. Thank you so much. We'll have you back because I think our next time together, we'll have to go a little bit deeper on politics because we'll have perhaps a lot more to talk about with respect to midterms and the ramp up to the big election.
Yeah, we are going to have a lot to talk about.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily.
Rick.
Great to have you on the Healthcare Nation podcast, and we'll see you again. The opinions expressed by the host and guests are for informational purposes only and not associated with any companies or academic institutions. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts, as well as our YouTube channel, Healthcare Nation Podcast. And if you have any questions or want to contact us, please reach out to healthcarenationpodcast.com.